some new faces on the stage, which I'll just go around and allow the guys to introduce themselves before we move into the questions themselves. But thanks very much for your attention thus far. Maybe starting first, Kym, do you want to do a quick intro on yourself?
Sure. Kym Lukins. I'm working at Worldline. I represent a division that services global companies. So global payment service solution for both kind of the traditional kind of multinationals that were being discussed, as well as the kind of pure e-com single entity cross-border processing.
Cool. Anirudh?
Hi, Anirudh. I currently lead the payments team at Hopper. We are an online travel agency. We sell everything from flights, hotels, car rentals, apartments soon. We are the third biggest OTA in the US, and we have set up operations in APAC, LATAM, and Europe. So obviously, given a huge need to drive cross-border payments, accept payments from our customers globally, but also pay them out in all the different regions located. Yeah.
Great, thank you. So please do add your questions as they occur to you. But maybe just starting with a quick question that occurred to me whilst you guys were presenting, and maybe actually starting with Anirudh. In terms of when you look at your customers and you want to convert a customer who's spending time on your website, they've decided they want to buy a flight or whatever it may be, they get to the payment transaction and it doesn't work. What approaches do you take to optimizing conversion of those customers? What do you see works best for you?
Yeah, so that's like a multi-faceted question, right? So, I mean, just imagine a customer has actually gone through the entire process of selecting where they want to go, which hotel they want to stay, flights, and they've gone through the entire decision making. And once they come to the checkout and it's like, say, pay, and it fails, that's like literally like stopping your customers from giving you money, right? So there are a lot of different things that you can do. So one is obviously trying to understand what is the root of that problem, where the payment decline comes from. A lot of the times it's just like the different processors you work with. You can do a retrial logic, different processors. Also, like depending on where the customer is. So working domestic acquirers versus international acquirers. So you can do a lot around just like making sure the card transaction works, but also like trying to provide the customers different form of payment methods, right? So if their bank payment or card fails, maybe they can try with a different payment method. So having a more seamless experience, obviously understanding the root cause, but also guiding them to corrective actions helps quite a bit.
Sounds great. Kym, I don't know whether you've got any views on this question?
Pretty well covered from a merchant perspective, so there's not a lot. I mean, again, it's focusing on your consumer and starting from there and understanding your fraud perspective, who you're doing business with, what their capabilities are, what the market capabilities are, and then, entering into that also technical element of being able to interact with your customer for anything outside of just the retry logic. Yeah.
Sounds good. I don't know whether, Chris, have you got any views?
Yeah, I guess from a bank's perspective, supporting a merchant, clearly the currency capability is really important, and making it seamless for that individual to pay in the local currency. Okay, so it's kind of the basic requirement to kind of make them less confused, less worried about, am I going to get charged exorbitant FX fees? So our ability as a bank to then support the merchant with those physical accounts for settlement, for example, in those currencies if need be, I think is an interesting one. And these may be individuals who are paying by something other than card, as we've talked about. There may be APMs in there. And so the ability for a merchant to collect locally in that local currency, I think is something where the banks can come in and sort of support that process.
Sounds good. Max, Timo?
Yeah, no, I think I see this in three pillars. So I think we've touched on in a certain session yesterday regarding the omni-channels experience and converting your customers in offering him a frictionless experience at checkout and the cross synergy within the different channels. So there's that aspect to the conversion, bringing your customers to shop and click the button pay. But then, as you rightly mentioned, there is post the pay, right? And what happens if the payment fails? So all the work in terms of analyzing the authorization authorization data that you will collect from your PSP gateways and understanding the reasons for the decline, and then working with your supply chain, with your issuers, with your fraud providers, your PSP gateways to understand what the reasoning behind that decline codes, and then find a strategy to resolve it. And then I think the last point that I would just like to comment on this is the local capabilities, right? You mentioned local processing. I think that's a really big, important theme, but also from a customer perspective, right? When I see carte bancaire on the checkout, immediately I feel at home, right? So again, presentment currencies, payment methods, that is all those sorts of products that a merchant can offer in conjunction with their payments partners to really feel them, get them to convert into a sale.
Yeah, and in the moment itself, I think it's also about communication with the customer, because in the end they need to understand that this payment has failed with payment method X, and therefore you are offering payment methods Y, Z, and making sure that they then choose a different payment method by actually communicating in a positive way with them and reinforcing them that they are doing the right decision with taking this purchase, and not leaving them with a bad last experience, because it might be the last touch point they have with you as a merchant if the payment fails and they're never coming back. And you want to end this as positively as possible.
Actually, I suppose continuing with the first question there on Slido on a related issue about sort of dynamic payment presentment. So altering what is presented to different customers in different contexts. I don't know whether who wants to kick off. Anupam, do you want to?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it does make a lot of sense to have dynamic representation, especially in different contexts, right? So the basic one is users in different countries. So it doesn't really make a lot of sense to show the carte bancaire to maybe a user in India. They're going to get confused, right? So obviously first show localized and relevant payment methods for that customer. Then also you can have go a bit more into personalization to an extent that, hey, what was the payment method I previously selected or I paid with? Have that as a default payment option that's prominently selected, right? Then you can also have a more dependencies on your businesses, right? So we have a lot of different verticals. We have air, hotels, etc. And we have different unique flows. We have pay later at the hotel. So you cannot really pay with a buy now, pay later potentially at the hotel, right? So again, depending on different use cases, you also have to present appropriately. So I think those are sort of makes a lot of sense. Now I think maybe there's a question, maybe if I'm double clicking on this, it's more if the same user, maybe for the same group of users from the same country, should we be showing them for if they keep coming back, right? I'm not so sure about that, but I think for different contexts, I think it makes actually a lot of sense.
I don't know how the rest of you guys, whether there's stuff you want to chip in.
Yeah, happy to chip in. I think there's two ways to answer that question. There is a static way, and I think it's extremely important to understand the influence that has to put the positioning of certain payment types on the checkout page, particularly, of course, in the online environment, and the way you can advertise your customers to select a payment method over another. And you would have seen that certain partners are doing a lot of competing in the buy now, pay later space, particularly with all those click to pay before, incentivizing to go to a checkout that is much more quicker and faster. So again, there's a lot of competition on the e-commerce side to incentivize customers to select a checkout or have visibility. One of the recent projects that we conducted, and I think that really answers the question here, is in Germany, you'll be all very familiar that Rechnungszahlung and invoice payment is extremely important to offer. And we work with the merchants to understand with a credit sort of check provider in the background, as your customers input the details on the payment page, well, actually, how can that dynamically, propose a checkout that offer Rechnungszahlung or invoice payments if meeting all the certain financial conditions in the background, to avoid the frustration, because what you don't want is to offer invoice payments or buy now, pay later, and then subsequently that customers will be rejected. So again, that's an example that can sort of answer that question. So yes, there are variables in markets, and based, again, there is a business case to be derived, but there is the possibility to engage with your payments gateway to dynamically offer certain subset of payment methods.
I suppose continuing on a similar theme, that second question there, there's one thing which says I will localize my payment type for Ideal or for invoice payments or whatever it may be. But in terms of active steering, whether that be on conversion or on cost, when we talk to our clients about moving from, an almost alphabetical or, what you selected last time preference to one where you say, I actively want you to pick X versus Y, they sometimes feel a little bit itchy that the regulator's going to stamp on them and say, well, no, it's customer choice. You shouldn't be promoting one over the other. And you've seen regulators such as those in Sweden actively requiring merchants to promote some debit-type payments over credit-type payments. Again, it'd be great to get your views on that active steering question. Again, I don't know, Chris, whether you want to...
I think before we go to active steering, I think one thing that's also quite important in this space is when you've got a payment type that the local government has enforced. So if you think about Pay by Bank in the UK, when you now pay your government taxes in the UK, you have a Pay by Bank option. Okay, and I think that that's helpful for us as an industry in terms of giving a validation to this is a payment type that I'm going to be used to as a consumer because I do it for my taxes, and therefore when I see it on a merchant site, I'll feel more comfortable doing that. So one discussion, and you said it's a delicate conversation, but in terms of inciting move towards an APM, clearly the costs linked with a pay-by-bank transaction, for example, in the UK are very different to the cost to acquire that through a merchant process, through a card scheme. And there is the potential to pass that through to the consumer in terms of a deduction or a voucher to go and spend again. And I think that there are a number of our merchants that are looking at that as a way to incentivize a pay-by-bank route rather than the card route. But again, you need to be very careful in terms of the local regulation and what's allowed. But that's definitely an area that we've seen merchants consider.
Cool, sounds good. Kim, any views?
Yeah, I think it's a balance, right? I mean, coming back to a consumer perspective, you don't want to also, at the end of the day, you want to sell, right, as a merchant. So you don't want to also make it too hard for a consumer to kind of, scroll through, etc., just to pay at the end of the day. So I think it's a real balance. Great, you want to reduce costs from a merchant perspective, and I absolutely understand that. But it's also a level of focusing on the consumer journey, because I think, there's also a consumer journey from a payment method perspective. I think you touched on, multiple channels. So are you on your mobile checking out, or are you online on a computer? Different consumer journeys which will work less or more effective. But also just considering again, is it the fee reductions that we want to focus on, or is it cost optimization and therefore perhaps driving revenue through the choice of payment methods rather than only kind of a cost reduction? So pushing, it's a big balance, and I think at the end of the day, again, the consumer should be at the focus of that.
Control. That sounds good. Maybe just moving on, because I know you guys touched on it when you were talking earlier, Max and Timo. In terms of when something goes wrong, do you have a hierarchy that says, well, the customer tried their card, it declined, now present X? Presenting the same card again may result in the same issue. Maybe starting with you guys, do you have a view on that sort of hierarchy of payment types or sequence even?
It fully depends on the kinds of merchants that we're working with, because for some merchants, productivity of payment methods differs fully from the others. And some merchants also put different focuses in terms of their payments priorities and payments KPIs. But if you look at conversion, there's smart retry possibilities on the card side. So you can first of all stay within the same payment method and then move towards payment methods that are highest ranking in terms of approval rates for that merchant industry specifically, and that needs to be determined based on data and based on data analysis and understanding what the merchant approval rates profile looks like, so that then you can choose, okay, does it make sense to then afterwards go with, for example, a pay-by-bank or open banking solution that you want to try out as a next step, or whether you want to offer a PayPal solution within a country which is very high ranked in terms of customer preference. So it's unfortunately the answer is it depends.
It depends.
It depends on data and analysis and what the merchant profile really needs.
Cool. Anirudh, I don't know whether you've got any.
Yeah, I think some very similar veins, right? So first, I think it's like sort of like silent and background changes you can do. So retry, route to the different processor to see basically actually if you can recover the transaction. The second layer is like obviously when it doesn't work, like actually let the customer know what happened. If it's insufficient funds or maybe there's expired card, they can actually change something within the payment instrument to actually make it work. And if that is not going to be successful, then you sort of like start guiding them into different payment methods, right? And also like, if it's a fraud reject, like you can actually try to get them to pay with maybe an Apple Pay because it has like lower fraud rate on that, right? So I think like this, like, yes, I think there are layers like background, try to get them to rectify with the same payment method, changing details, and then potentially guide to a different payment instrument.
But I think it's also that's at the checkout stage, but it's also before you get there, I think there should be considerations around potentially looking to combine payment methods. I think Ideal was mentioned before. This is pretty well known, I think, for the Netherlands as a real-time one-off banking. But I still see for the subscription people, quite a lot of people don't still kind of understand that you can actually then put separate direct debit off the back of it. So you kind of, your customer journey on the first transaction is a much better journey, and you as a company get the better guarantees of the real-time banking solution. But off the back of that, you can kick off a separate direct debit, which still then is the kind of cost element and kicks off the subscription planning. So it's about, I think, looking at it also, okay, not just like, oh, we're trying with this and then going to this, but okay, is there partners that can help combining as well?
I mean, that's something that we've started to do quite a lot of work on, these hybrid payment types, particularly with open banking, combining the best of a one-time payment with a direct debit. I don't know whether any of the other panel members have got views on where the merchant starts doing the heavy lifting of combining bits of payment functionality to deliver better customer outcomes. I don't know whether.
I just want to comment on what Kym said. Of course, when you assess the overall business case of deciding to implement a payment methods, or there's of course the direct cost of acceptance, but there's also all the indirect cost of acceptance. And transaction speed is super important when we engage with IT stakeholders, particularly on certain projects. I'll give an example exactly. In Germany, there is the Java card schemes at point of sales, but you also have the SEPA-Lastschrift, the direct debits at the point of sales, and the partners, Worldline, the different partners that we have that have a different products that are of accepting those transactions at the point of sales. And again, as part of that business case, is not only the cost of acceptance, is beyond. It's also about the customer's experience. And for example, the tap and go limit at €50. Well, you can offset that with that sort of product at the point of sales, and therefore generate further values because of the transaction speeds and non-authentication on the terminal device beyond the €50 limit. So that's a very German-specific example. But again, just to your comment about, as part of the overall business case, there is the direct cost of acceptance, but there's also the values from the solution in terms of transaction speed, in terms of the authorization time, the latencies, all those sort of variables that are extremely important to assess.
There's a question coming in from the audience. We've got about 5 minutes to go, so if you do have any burning questions, please pop them on the board. Otherwise, you'll have to contact the guys after the time. But there's a question here about how you keep it simple, how you prioritize. But maybe I'll ask that question more generically. That's predicated on data, right? So you use data to pick preferred payment type, which I know you guys have spoken before, but in terms of getting hold of the data that you need to make those decisions, Have you found that that's a relatively easy thing to do, or actually it's a massive issue and requires a project in and of itself to get the information you need in order to be able to answer these questions? So, it's a question. Maybe Chris, you start with you.
Okay. Probably more from
lots of
perspective.
Yeah, so
I think it's more relevant.
No, absolutely. I think this is obviously part of process. Like whenever we think about a new payment method in different regions, right? So typically the process we have identified is obviously we do a market research. Like if there's an upcoming payment method, like what the local employees or the local consumers are telling us. But in terms of actually validating how to do it, what we do is that we do what we call like a smoke testing or fake door testing. We actually just put the option in the checkout and actually see how many consumers are actually tapping on it, just to see actually like, hey, if there is actually usage from our consumers before we actually build out the entire thing. We obviously limit it to a small percentage of traffic. When you click on it, we just select, like, fine, it's coming soon, it will be available soon, but it gives us a lot of indication whether our customers are actually gonna pay with it. And that's how we typically do that. And obviously paired with customer research as well. We send out a survey like saying that, hey, you couldn't pay, or if there's a payment method you would like. So that's typically how we run the process of thinking about what payment methods to be offered. And then again, I think there's a second part of the question is about, like, it gets messy, right? So how do you actually have not like 10 or 15 different checkout options? So I think it's like you have to have a very clean IA, only show the top payment methods, and maybe hide or collapse the long tail of payment methods. I think like it's important to have a clear IA, so that not as to clutter the checkout page with too many payment options.
I would just add that you're unlikely to be the first merchant that is going through this thought process, yeah? And so engage with the banks, with the third-party vendors as well that you're dealing with to have that conversation. They will have the knowledge of what other merchants are doing in that market, what's been successful. They will have some data that they can share, anonymized, in terms of what the bank thinks or what the provider thinks. So I think it's really relying on those partnerships that you have to guide you, and then keeping it simple. Once you've made that decision and you've seen the information from those other parties and other providers, keep it simple.
Cool. Where the guys here? Kym, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think it's been covered pretty well. I could maybe take it at slightly more macro level, which is similar kind of ideal, but typically a similar kind of pain point or difficulty is also with people trying to process locally, from a global perspective without local entities. And that's a very similar kind of, what are we going to do? We want to process, but we don't want to invest in a legal entity there, etc. So we're seeing a lot more demand for that kind of, ability where that's also a strategic focus of ours, is to service as many kind of markets like that without a local entity. And that gives a couple of things. It gives merchants access to the market and increased basically local market coverage, because you get the local payment methods, banking stuff that's not so much cross-border. There's also the fee estimate, but it's also depending on the business, it can be interesting, because it also gives an ability, even for the traditional market players, for example, who have local entities and the luxury of that. Sometimes they have an initiative, right, which is then they want to keep the P&L by the headquarters. And this gives them an opportunity to process locally and access those payment methods, but then keep the P&L back there. So a little bit of a tangent, sorry, but kind of at the end of the day, it's the same pain point of how do I get access to these new customer journeys and potentially new customers. Yeah.
Cool, thank you. I'm aware there was one question for the CMPSI guys, but I'll let you take that one offline, if that's okay, partly because we've got 3 seconds left. So first of all, thank you ever so much to the panel members for their time today.